I'm learning, you're learning, so let's learn together. I'll do all the footwork and heavy lifting to find the guests and subjects that will help broaden our understanding of the Civil War. All I ask from you is your support. Please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and learn with me. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And I thank you in advance.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios, you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today, it's kind of fitting that we have our guest in today from the Valley Forge area to talk about Valley Forge because it's freezing out and there's snow and ice all over the place. And so we didn't know that, of course, when we set this up, but Ken Gavin has been on Patreon for a couple of episodes. We talked about Gettysburg during the American Revolution, part 1 and 2. And I said, why don't we have you back on for Valley Forge? Now you may be saying, what does this have to do with Gettysburg? What does it? Anything? Nothing, right? Not really.
Not really.
No. But you know what? We like history, and we have the 250th anniversary or birthday of the country coming up. And so we said, let's just start dipping our toes into this other stuff as well, because you need to cleanse the palate every once in a while when you do this every day of your life.
We do, and it's history is a continuum.
By the way, welcome, Ken.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
You're welcome.
And as usual, I will make a push for two things. One, if you are not a patron, do it immediately.
Oh wow, thank you.
You're welcome. It's
the check is in the mail, Ken.
Thank you. All zeros at the end of that, but at least I get Matt Callery's signature on it.
It's all zeros,
right?
Not at the end, all the way through.
All zeros all the way through, but Matt signed it. So.
It's a significant, symbolic check,
right?
Yes.
And the other is Little Ground Top. Had mine this morning, so buy yours.
How do you like it for real?
I do really love it.
Okay,
yeah,
really?
Yeah, we talked about it before, and I do. We have the shared sophisticated palate. I get those notes of black pepper.
You do get the black. A lot of people don't get the black pepper.
Just a little touch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People get the notes of cacao.
Yeah.
They get the toasted sugar.
Yeah.
They get the wild grass or whatever it is. What is it? Wildflowers. But nobody ever gets the black pepper like we do.
Only the most sophisticated.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. It's too sophisticated to get the other ones, though. I can't taste the other things.
Valley Forge, we did cover it a little bit in the past. There are connections. There are folks from what will become Gettysburg who are at Valley Forge, who are serving in various Pennsylvania regiments. And this area is also supplying the Continental Army with supplies. So Alexander Dobbin is renting wagons and horses. There's wheat. There's other things that are coming from this area. So there are connections, but, history, you could look at it as a continuum. If there is no revolution, if there is no Valley Forge, maybe there's no country, there's no Battle of Gettysburg to talk about.
True. Now, okay, so let me just fill you in on what you're dealing with here with me, okay? My knowledge of Valley Forge, I've been there twice, if I recall. Once I don't even know if it would be a tour, but I was with someone who claimed to know what they were talking about. It was a friend. We went into the museum, and, I've seen a documentary or two over the years about Valley Forge. I grew up outside of Morristown, New Jersey. Jockey Hollow is one of the sites there. And Jockey Hollow Rangers would tell me Valley Forge gets all the credit for being a hard winter, but it was actually a worse winter here at Valley Forge. The difference being the Army figured out how to deal with it from Valley Forge, and so we didn't have as much casualties and sickness and death and all that other stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, there's always that East Coast, West Coast, Valley Forge, Morristown thing over the years. I know Rangers who've worked at both sites. And there is. Morristown does get short shrift considering how bad the situation was there with supply.
It's in New Jersey too.
The Army was there for two different winters, but the second winter that they're at Morristown and up at Jockey Hollow is the one that you're talking about. So, the supply situation is worse there, basically because of weather. That winter of 79-80 one of the worst on record in North America.
Did they call it a mini ice age or something like that? Not that winter specifically, but that period of time.
That period's been referred to as a mini ice age, but that winter, in terms of the severity of snowfall, the frequency of snowfall, the cold temperatures, that winter of 79-80 really freezes the Army in place in that encampment. And you can't get in, you can't get out. So supplies are really bad up there. Also, the Army's dealing with mutinies at Morristown.
I was just going to say,
dealing with at Valley Forge.
You know who could get out? Deserters. Right. Real quick, I know we're doing a Valley Forge show, but what's interesting is what is it? Federal Hill up in Kinnelon, New Jersey, I believe, is where they caught up to them and hanged them, except for one.
Right.
So he could come back and tell everybody what happens when you mutiny.
So there are a couple of instances with those, the Jersey line, the Pennsylvania line. There were instances of one being pardoned. But it's the shock value of having watched that. My understanding of the mutinies at Morristown, and when the Jersey line is going to mutiny at Pompton Lakes, when Washington approves the sentences for those executions, they're executed by their own kind.
Right.
Other troops from the Jersey line are going to stand there. And then if, there's a line of men with loaded muskets, and then behind them, if they fail to do their duty, there's a line waiting to take them out.
Jeez.
So, there's a lot of powerful symbolism to that. But yes, Morristown, it's very different there. The Valley Forge winter, the Army that's there is going to suffer a lot differently because they are so new to military service. The Army, when you look at it, I think there's probably a misperception that, the Continental Army, these guys are fighting for the entire war. Well, the entire war is 8 years. There's very few soldiers who will go through multiple enlistments and fight for the entire war. The Army at Valley Forge is a very new one. In terms of men coming into military service. In 1775, 1776, Congress would only authorize 1-year enlistments.
Okay.
Because Congress is afraid of a standing army posing a threat to the Republic. They look to the example of ancient Rome and Roman history, right? By the time you get to early 77, Congress is starting to see the value of a force that can be kept together for a longer period. Because Washington is complaining frequently. A year, maybe I can get these guys whipped into useful shape, and then they're gone.
Right.
And of course they want to go home. There's nothing keeping them here. So the Army that assembles in early 1777 is going to be the one who is at Valley Forge fighting in a bulk for the remainder of the year with new folks coming on. Those guys are enlisting for 3 years of the war. But Valley Forge is the first winter where they're going to have to learn how to deal with winter encampments, hygiene, things of that nature, which is all down the road, I think, for us to talk about. But I
got a quick question. You mentioned about the standing army thing, right? I don't study revolutions too much. So is it abnormal in revolutions for the revolutionary fighting force to resemble anything of a regular army? Is it typically militias? So in other words, this problem of men leaving, come and go as they please, short-term enlistments or a year or whatever, and not really feeling as a cohesive unit.
Right.
Is that just kind of the way it's always been? And then we came along and someone was like, hey, maybe we should have a regular army of some sort.
It depends on the revolution. I think as major world revolutions go, and an 8-year military conflict is probably on the high end. It may be the longest. I mean, if you think about the Russian Revolution, that's a fairly short thing, right? But in any revolution, you're going to have leaders who have military experience there. I think you're coalescing political, military, and civilian forces to affect societal change. So I think that's there. And, there's a military component that's always going to be built into it. If the revolution is short, it doesn't really matter. But I think you're tapping into something, Matt, that bears discussion. And when I've worked at Valley Forge for 18 years now. This is my 18th season. I'm not a National Park Service employee, but I am on staff there as an interpretive tour guide and do a lot of work with public history. So that's been a joy for the past 18 years. It's a lot different than the way the things will function out here with tours in Gettysburg.
Sure.
It's not, the demand is not as high. So you could have, X number of licensed guides who maybe are doing a couple hundred tours a year. Some of them, last year was my busiest season ever. I had 61 tours. It's still a lot, you know.
There's a lot, yeah.
But we have less guides out there, and there are less groups that are coming in per se, even though it's still a very busy place.
How many visitors do you get annually?
1.5 million, 2 million, something in that range.
It's more than we get.
So, but there's a lot of folks who are coming through on the counts, Matt, who are there as recreational. They have a lot of trails that are contiguous throughout the park.
Okay.
So you get
it's not
runners, joggers,
well, it's still
right?
visitors.
Still visitors who are coming in.
Right.
It's going to be less.
Something might rub off.
Tours. Yeah. So one of the things that I always really like to do is put Valley Forge in context. And, I've talked about Carl Becker on the program a little bit before. Carl Becker's an historian working in the first half of the 20th century in the United States. And he was trying to look at history for the value of the general public. And when he was looking at history for the value of the general public, he was talking to folks who would be engaged in what we call public history today and saying, you need to try to take things down to simpler terms, but don't lose the complexities at the same time. That's the great challenge of the work. And when you look at an historical event, Becker would tell you that there is an ephemeral version and an affirmed version. The ephemeral version is the way it happens in history. It can happen one way. That's it. It's factual. It's one way. The affirmed version of the event is what historians play with: a shape, mold, evolve over time. And when they're doing that work, it behooves us to be very careful with how we do that, because you start to change the event from what it actually was to fit a need, whether that's political, whether that's social, etc. So he was very committed to sticking to the facts. Part of what he would, like would be context. Because unless you provide context for an historical event, you start getting into affirmed versions that are really falsehoods. And for Valley Forge, what I find with many visitors is they labor under the assumption that nothing really happened here. The army showed up, it was tired, it was sick, it was demoralized. For whatever reason, they fell over here on December 19th of 1777. They hung out in the cold, they tried to survive, and then they wait for this guy named von Steuben to come in and whip the army into shape so they can go fight. And it creates these really weird falsified bookends that don't do the actual story justice. One of the really hard things about doing work at Valley Forge is we're trying to cover a 6-month time period when the Army's there.
Yeah.
And really to contextualize that with the Philadelphia campaign that precedes it, I get 90 minutes on a lucky day, 2 hours to tell a 9-month story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like Gettysburg, you're dealing with a 3-day battle. If you want to look at the campaign, I know it's longer than that. You go back to early June, but
you come here and you get the battle story.
It's a bit different. So, I think the context in many ways with Valley Forge is important, and I think that's where we should start.
Well,
really.
So, okay, there's so many questions. Oh, okay. So the context. Why don't we start with that? Give us the context of Valley Forge. We'll move from there.
I think it's a different kind of place in Pennsylvania. And that's what you...
Hold on. I'm sorry. One of the questions came back to me, and I don't... Because it's based on something you said before, and I don't want to get too far away from it. The American Revolution. Now, I haven't read up on that as much as Gettysburg and all that stuff. But is it... It seems to me that there's what I was taught in school... There's what we've seen in popular culture. Mm-hmm. There's what we've heard. And then when you talk to somebody who really studies the revolution, they're like, no, it's complete. It's like a totally different story. And it's almost, to me, I think of, I remember my grandmother had this thing on the wall that she must have gotten during the bicentennial. Mm-hmm. And it was of, I think, Betsy Ross, sewing the flag and something. And then she had like this metal kind of pop out 3D looking type of continental soldier, with a musket standing next to it. And then a few of those like Franklin mint plates in her curio cabinet and everything. But there seems to be a what's the word I'm looking for? Like almost that the revolution was Hollywoodized. Mm-hmm. I would imagine in order to get the country started, not so much started, but to keep it going
right
after it was started. So not necessarily for the revolutionary generation, but for their children and grandchildren, mm-hmm. they had to almost mythological. Like George Washington and I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down a cherry tree and all that stuff. Bullshit.
Right. I think
Where's that come from?
So it comes from the 19th century, mid-19th century, and progressing up into the period of the centennial in the 1870s is when you start to see a lot of that mythology take place. Because by that...
The rest of this preview is available over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.